Chapter 3 Dropouts and the Jukebox 1. 3 years of wandering from one class to the next had eaten away at my happiness, what little I had. I'd sit wishing painfully for the clock to speed up. Eventually, I began to suspect that time, through the measurement of that clock, was stopping at the instant I looked away from it, regardless of what classroom or what wall from which it hung. It was as if it were laughing at me, teasing me, allowing me, or perhaps causing me to wallow in my unwanted solitude, a solitude which was only broken by a visit to or from my old friend every 3 or 4 months. Even so, 3 years had disappeared from my youth without so much as a party or prom or even a date. There were whispers in the halls, and there were whispers in my thoughts, and from the whispers of my parents, I knew they had a substantial measure of worry they'd spent on me. Mom would say, in one of her smaller attempts at communicating with me, that the gray hair she'd begun to acquire was due to me. With a smile on her face and an attempt to act serious, she'd make me get close enough to see the one single strand of hair she'd found, pulling it away from all the others. "See? Do you see this, sweetie?" I think maybe she was right, that I caused her hair to turn gray. I didn't mind so much these little attempts at communication, these little comments. They were much better than the occasional weirdness of worry, like when she'd assure me that masturbation was normal, that being antisocial was unhealthy, or that marijuana would fry my brain. And because these 3 points were lumped together in each of these talks of hers, I didn't dare deny smoking marijuana because of the silent confession that could be inferred by her on the other 2 points. The strife in my teenaged world was authentic enough, but this didn't keep me from graduating high school. Yes, that fractured existence did discourage me to the point I didn't want to invest heavily in any class, but it motivated me to the point that I would work hard enough to finally get it behind me. And with that motivation, it wasn't so hard to do well enough. During my last year at Salt Creek High School, academic reports had suddenly become more detailed, with graphs, charts, and more information to help the graphs and charts make sense. This report had become particularly popular. At least it was that year because of its newness, most specifically to the students who excelled. Because of one graph in that report, Dad had given me a nickname. He didn't say it publicly, but only to me. He called me Median. His humor was by way of a kind heart, but it hurt me nonetheless. He thought it was an apt name since I'd achieved the quiet honor of being perfectly average, dead smack in the middle. I was a loser of nothing, champion of nothing. Regarding my position in the class, there were the same number of seniors with a higher grade point average than there were below. "You know I'm kidding, right, son?" he'd ask after the insult, not backing off the statement, but still wanting to soften the truth of my mediocrity. And he'd punctuate the explanation with a knuckle rub to the head. "Yeah, Dad, I know," I'd say, understanding he loved me. Even though Watertown Community College was a school that nearly anyone with a high school diploma could get into, providing the student could cover the cost of tuition and books, there was a form of victory within me when I was first accepted. I'm afraid it was a short-lived affair, though, because, well, I'd failed at Watertown due to my lack of discipline and flat-out disinterest in the core classes. The only exception to this was college algebra, because even with it being a 101 course and a couple steps backward from where we were in high school, I did find it enjoyable. Troy, funny enough, had a similar, albeit more exciting, experience. Troy's failure had begun on a very proud and positive note by receiving a full ride, due to his running ability, to attend the University of South Dakota. The university sits on the south side of the state, way down in Vermilion, almost Nebraska. His parents were very proud before his fall, particularly Mrs. Wilson, who had made sure my mother had known of her son's track star success each time they had crossed paths in Salt Creek. Once, while she was working in the kitchen, I heard Mom yelling at Dad, actually, while he sat in the living room. Not once does that witch ever ask how Finnegan's been doing. Oh, she makes me so mad. She's so selfish, and everyone knows why she still cruises through our town. She doesn't have any business here, except at the bank in the back room with Tom Jennings, maybe. Coming to Salt Creek, I tell you. What excuse could she possibly have coming here? Groceries? I bet there are 10 grocery stores in Oakwood. We have 2. That fancy Thunderbird she drives? You've seen it? Of course you have. She has a couple giant stickers plastered on the back of it now. Did you see that yet? One of them. Finny, sweetie, can you get this for me? I hustled into the kitchen to retrieve a pot in an upper cabinet. I'd done this, and also return it to its place maybe 4 times a week at least. Through the years, I'd peaked at my 6'0" height. Thank you, sweetie. Anyways, it says S.D. Coyote's mom, and the other says Coyote Crazies or something or another. Oh, and you can bet, too, she wouldn't be caught dead without wearing the most recent and lowest cut USD shirt available while doing errands, showing her boobs to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Good God, what a whore. Dad responded, I don't know about Dick and Harry. I'm sure Tom gets an eyeful. He laughed at his own joke. Mom laughed a snort. She went on and on about the busybody whose husband never seemed to be by her side. I suppose that their encounters, being one-sided, were a good thing for me, considering I wasn't too interested in others discovering my colossal-sized college flop. The track and field team at South Dakota hadn't even had their first team meeting of the year when the dean of students invited Troy to come into his office, an invitation that was extended this one time only. Troy was told, without even a real opportunity to share his side of the story, not that he would have, to pack his dorm, all of his personal belongings, and leave immediately. This was due to the fact that he was spotted by campus security rushing into the building way beyond curfew. He was also placed via closed-circuit television running across the top of parked cars, which were next to Coronado dorms at 3 a.m, leaping from the last car onto the block wall perimeter and out of sight. The video and the encounter with security had him pinned. He'd damaged some of the cars, and they suspected that he had even stolen the motorcycle that had gone missing that same night. Evidently, it was parked out of camera range at the edge of the lot. Eventually, after the story pointed at him without a doubt, he confessed everything, except for stealing the motorcycle and the name of the 2 others who were chasing him. Yes, chasing him. They wanted names of the other 2 that had been caught in the video production. Troy refused to blow the whistle on the others. Unfortunately, the video wasn't clear enough to ID the other runners. The other 2 who followed came into the camera's frame about 20 seconds behind Troy, except, unlike Troy, behind the parked cars, on the ground. These 2, walking in the unlit perimeter, stood, catching their breath, pointing in the direction of the wall, and walked away. The school decided not to pursue the ground runners. Besides the possibility of them being involved in the motorcycle theft, breaking curfew, provided they were students, was the only rule broken. His dad, Troy's, apologized and paid in full for the bad decision his son had made. Now, in keeping with the teenager who always gets out of trouble way of life, none of that night was reported to the police. Therefore, Troy didn't do any time, and it didn't go on his record outside the university. The 4 vehicles that had reportable damage were all dents on the hoods, and all 4 were owned by kids who were attached to the athletic dorms. Athletes. Because Troy was an athlete, there was an effort to keep it hushed for the university's sake. The coach was involved in the attempt to keep it quiet. This desire to keep things quiet ended up benefiting Troy only. This news made it to the second page of the Oakwood Times the day after Troy returned home, and the next day following that, It was on KDLT News at 6 o'clock. This turned into a big embarrassment for Mr. Wilson's boss, who, incidentally, had received his master's degree there, and who also had sent a letter of recommendation for Troy in the first place, by which the eventual scholarship had come. Mr. Ned Wilson was let go soon after. His termination was said to be cutbacks, but everyone knew different, and soon enough there was nary a sticker to be seen on the Cambry-Wilson Thunderbird. A rolling testament from that time forward that brought my mom joy each time she would see that car drive by. After I had dropped out, before Troy's fiasco, I became determined, because it seemed a good option to me, that I'd join the Army. One particular Thursday, while I walked back and forth in front of a door which led into the Army recruiting office. And while I was looking inside, I noticed the uniformed men finally had walked to the back. I popped in to snag a handful of brochures that were neatly stacked on the front desk. I was gone just as quickly as I had dashed in. I heard a hello, but kept my head down and kept walking. Once home, I went into seclusion into my room and read, over and over, the points I wanted to make with my parents in case they objected to this decision. They didn't object. "I think that would be a good idea, son. A very responsible decision," Dad said, with a genuine pride for me showing through his eyes. Mom just sat there, nodding her head in agreement, looking as if she were searching for the words to speak, looking peaked slightly. Her hands were rubbing back and forth nervously along the length of her thighs over her nylon skirt. Her lips were pursed. Then, "I agree with your father. That would be a very responsible move for you to take under the circumstances." I'd heard that tone many times before. She sounded the same when she'd say, "Fine," to one of my many times, although years had passed since, asking if I could eat dinner at the Wilsons after she'd spent the afternoon preparing a meal. 2. Dad and I were in the backyard raking leaves when the back door to the house opened. Then I heard Mom say to someone as she held the screen door open, "There they are, sweetie," she said, while pointing toward us. "Hey, Finn!" It was Troy's familiar greeting. "Mr. Barrett?" He reached out to shake my dad's hand. Dad responded by slapping his hand down and giving Troy a bear hug. I leaned on my rake for just a second and said with a twisted smirk, "So I hear you're back in Oakwood." "Yeah, last week." He was embarrassed. Everyone knew, especially in Salt Creek, where news like this is spoken of for weeks, mostly in hushed tones. Dad handed him his rake and began to pull off his gloves. "I'm glad you're here, Troy. There's only a little left to do," he said, indicating with the nod of his head toward the last corner of the yard. With his bare hand, he reached up and grabbed Troy's face endearingly, and a gentle slap. "You boys have fun. It's good to see you, kid." Troy took the hint and began raking as my dad walked away. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "Check it out, Finn," he whispered as he leaned in toward me. "Want some whiskey?" He pulled a flask from his coat pocket and gestured that it was full with a little shake. "No, thanks." I hated it when he unnecessarily risked getting caught, when all he would have to do is wait for just a second longer. I shook my head as the rush of the strangeness and familiarity shot through me. "Your dad doesn't mind." He sipped as his eyes turned sharp toward the house, quickly flipping the top back on the bottle, screwing it on tightly. "Then why did you bother whispering?" I said, challenging his phony bravado. He gave me a look. "I was thinking, Finn. Remember when we, He paused and trailed off for a second as he shoved the flask back into his pocket. "Remember when we talked about joining the Army?" His question was unexpected, and although thrilled a bit on what he might say, I stayed quiet, keeping a blank face. Then he said what I was hoping he would. "We should join together, like right away, don't you think? At the same time, I mean. Airborne Rangers or something like that." Remember when we talked about that when we were kids? We're still kids, Troy. And it was just a few years ago, I said in a dry tone as I began to rake again, pretending not to be overly interested in what he was saying. Besides, I thought, Troy had a habit of pressing until I caved, only to let me down or humiliate me in some way. Troy ignored my point. He was distracted by his thoughts, and based on how he had his nose up in the cold air, the smell of smoke. Dad had been burning the leaves downwind on the other side of the yard since we started a couple of hours earlier, but the smell had already fused itself into my sinuses, so I didn't think much about it, except from time to time when the smell was stronger, as the breeze would gently change directions, blowing the warm gray cloud toward us. The quiet between us had grown loud in my mind, causing me to think on what had plagued me through the last couple weeks. That besides the physical training, a major concern of mine was going into the service all alone. Entering the Army would be so much better with a friend. Troy went back to raking. The airs of contentment and stress competed between us. They were exaggerated in the silence. They spoke to me, and I replied without a word uttered. My conscience rebuked me for the thoughts I had had before that moment. Thoughts that wished for Troy's failure in college, forcing him to come back home, to be obliged to join me at the community college. I knew there was a chance that he'd do something to get him in trouble, and this opportunity had fueled my hope. But I never considered that he'd be kicked out of school for vandalism, or so early. Then the thought occurred to me as I raked and stole glances at his letterman's jacket, trying to read the patches that proclaimed his Oakwood High School accomplishments. In the military, would you even be able to do what you're told? If you can't do the right thing in a place that has very few rules, how will you survive in the United States Army, Troy? Then the thought occurred to me that the question of judgment within me could just as easily be aimed at myself. Being there with my friend, I began to empathize with him, to feel his pain somewhat. I considered what he must have been going through. There was an edge to him, it seemed, even in spite of his possible concerns and obvious failures. He continued to work the yard with diligence. The leaves were damp enough that they weren't blowing all over the place, easy to pile and rake. I took over Dad's job of pushing the leaves up into the middle of the already torched and blackened area, trying not to let the fire find its way onto the neighboring property. We stayed this way, busy at work, for more than an hour, quiet, as we developed a wordless system of leaf detail, each doing our own job, doing the job that was never assigned, but that we each assumed, both knowing all the while of what the other was thinking. Troy broke rank suddenly. "Get out of here," he yelled. "Leave it alone," I said, noticing he was wagging his rake in the direction of a blackbird, a grackle, perched on one of the two rusty posts that used to hold a clothesline. The bird had a purple and green sheen within its dark feathers, color that is only seen if you look carefully, if you pay attention. The sun makes a difference, and its surroundings make a difference in what you see in him. His bright yellow eyes made him seem as if he had a personality, or maybe that he could know more of you than you could of him. Dad thinks it likes us, that he's a loner with no mate, that he's an honorary Barrett. Troy put down his rake. "Really?" His face twisted into a knot. "That's kind of weird, I guess. Dad thinks it is the same one that's here year-round." "He name it?" he asked. "Hey, bird, what's your name?" It cracked a call, thrust its wings, and flew away. We felt accomplished after we finished the job. I invited my old friend to stay and eat. We took our lasagna to the living room, against my parents' wishes, while Mom and Dad stayed at the kitchen table. They gave up the small argument only because we'd been working. If we'd been goofing off, perhaps playing Atari, we'd have lost that contest and would have had to suffer the 20 questions by Mom and Dad regarding Troy's short-lived experience at USD. "I've been looking at these," I told Troy, as I tossed my collection of army brochures next to his plate on the ottoman. Listen, I've been thinking of this for a long time. I know we talked about this when we were kids. I don't think I want to be a ranger. I mean, I'd like to be airborne, at least, regardless of what job I end up with. He took a large bite of garlic bread, then set it back down on his plate, then knocking the buttery crumbs off from his hand onto his flannel shirt with the carelessness of a middle schooler. Seriously? He said, with his mouth full as he opened a brochure with his glossy hand, holding his fork in the other. He smiled. Son of a bitch, Finn. So you're for real. You really are doing this. And you were going without me? Hey, you were still at USD. How was I to know you were going to vandalize school property and get kicked out? My eyes showed surprise at the bluntness of my own words. His eyes came up to me again for a moment and back down. I needed to do something, Wilson, especially after the enormous disappointment I've been to my parents lately. I turned and pointed. When I walked in that door on a Tuesday night and announced I was dropping out, Mom and Dad were looking at me like I had just committed murder. And Troy coughed with a mouthful of lasagna. He struggled as he tried to chew and swallow. He coughed more, jumped up, and ran to the kitchen to retrieve the drink Mom offered him before but had turned down. Say, Finn, he said, walking back into the living room, composing himself. After we eat, let's get out of here. Lose? What do you say? 3. The sounds of the Seaberg Magnastar jukebox filled the bar with rhythm. That prize of a jukebox was second-hand from a bar in Aberdeen. More than once, Lou told us the story about how he was at Loggers Inn when the owner was, just then, according to the story, ready to replace it. Bought it for next to nothing. Right place, right time. He helped me load it in my pickup and everything. Great guy, he'd say proudly with his arm over the top of its ridged, square, 70s design, like it was his child who won the spelling bee. When talking of his prize, he'd rock onto his toes to make his tiny stature 2 inches taller. He'd tell anyone who would listen. Still works great. Doesn't she sound great? We fed that machine quarters all night. 2 quarters got us 5 selections. Troy was singing along with a song he randomly punched in, D8, the letters across the top, and the numbers across the bottom. Domo arigato, Mr. Roboto, domo arigato, Mr. Roboto. 3 ball, right there. Mr. Roboto. He stroked the shot masterfully. He was in the zone. I didn't stand a chance. Troy liked Lou's. He knew Lou's, but he wasn't the fixture he once was in town. Thankfully, Lou would let me in to play pool any time, but to drink beer I'd either have to be with Dad, which would mean 1 beer only, or endure the short lecture that I must be cool to not draw attention to my underaged self. Besides, he loved getting the little money I occasionally had, and to do that, he would need for me to eat bar food and or drink, because his praiseworthy Magnastar would only get from me a little more than $1 an hour if consistently playing. It was slow that night. It was just us 2 there, except for when a 30-something-looking lady, she wasn't from Salt Creek, with big hair came in and walked to the back with Lou. What the hell are they doing back there? I said, laughing, after they had been gone for several minutes. I teased that I was going to walk to the back and find out the truth to our entertaining mystery. Troy grabbed our empty pitcher and took an opportunity to top it off while we were unsupervised. Rack 'em, Peckerhead, he said as he leaned over the bar, pulling back the tap for a free refill. An intoxicated conclusion is what we made that night. We decided we weren't meant to be silly college boys anyways. Only we didn't say silly. But rather, it was destined that we were to accelerate toward becoming real men. Therefore, we were doing what 2 19-year-old men who had just failed at their less-than-stellar attempts at college should do. Drink a lot of beer and play pool at Lou's while discussing the future. And even though the cloud of failure loomed over us, we felt we were on the verge of finding some honor in our lives. and we'd found a way to laugh together again with our new positive outlook, the way we used to. We'll do everything exactly the same. That was our plan. We'd meet at the recruiter's office in a few days, giving us time to talk with our parents, and time to back out. That, of course, we did not discuss. Everything the same. Brothers. We shook on it sometime that night over the pool table. And because I'd already taken the time to flip through my brochures, I'd known that we wouldn't be able to just jump right into basic training. First, we'd have to answer a lot of preliminary questions, some regarding health. Some were psychiatric in nature. The ones that had Troy in a lather were regarding the law, misdemeanors and felonies. Dude, what if I can't get in? Troy worried. What if they call South Dakota? I'm screwed. Fuck. First of all, settle down. Second, they're not going to call Genius. They'll just make sure you're not a felon. Felon? Is that right? That sounds funny. Felon. Suddenly I was aware of my mouth's strange sounds. Anyways, people get in all the time with records. Besides, they're not looking for choir boys, I said, not knowing at all what my drunk self was talking about. Throughout that evening, I tried to convince Troy and myself that I was the authority on U.S. Army recruiting and that everything would be okay. After many games lost, I was slurring my words and the night had grown late. I couldn't feel my feet touching the ground, but even my drowned logic told me that they had to be. Look it, I gotta piss. When I get back, I'm gonna kick your ass, I declared as a matter of fact. Again? Wilson laughed hysterically, imitating Eddie Murphy's laugh. I grunted at him, annoyed, as I leaned my cue against the wall. Lou was walking down the narrow hallway as I walked toward the latrine that was in the back, behind the kitchen. All I could think about at the moment, through the dizziness, was that I had to go. He looked at me. He said something. It sounded as though I was listening to someone talk from an underwater Led Zeppelin concert. The music was loud. I got a woman, stay drunk all the time. Time skipped. The paneling in the bathroom closed me in as I took aim into the grimy toilet to relieve myself. My other hand was holding the wall. Troy's voice reverberated in my confused thoughts and memory. I could still hear the click of billiards through the thin walls as I listened to the echo of what he had said to me earlier. Finn, you're my buddy. I gotta talk to somebody about... Things got out of hand. That night... Jesus, I'm really in a mess, Finn. It was faint and jumbled. What the hell was he talking about? I thought. Or maybe said out loud. I'm not sure. My eyes were continually trying and catch themselves from the sideways movement. They tried to keep me from falling, as if to catch me. Things got out of hand. I listened as my mind continued its warp with the stretching of light and sound. It teased me through a cruel drunkenness. 4. Troy stopped his car in front of my home. He was silent. He just kept rubbing his finger back and forth across his mouth as if with an invisible napkin. His eyes searched and focused on nothing. Okay, yeah, maybe you're right, he said suddenly, trying to convince himself. What? Maybe they won't call USD. Oh, yeah. Like I said, you didn't get arrested. They don't really care. Your dad took care of the money side of it, right? I asked as I searched for the car handle in the dark. Right. His eyes checked his rearview mirror with a nervous regularity, wondering what he was looking at, or looking for. I said, It's all good then. Seriously, I think you're totally overreacting. Click. I opened the door. Okay. So we're going to meet at the recruiter's office when? Friday? Yep, 10 a.m. Be there or be square, I said as I stepped up out of his car. I was about to close the door. Finn, when will they send us to basic training again? He worried. Probably after Christmas. It's called delayed entry. Tell your dad delayed entry program. I struggled to say with eyebrows scrunched, surprised that I remembered our plans and that I remembered what I had read. "See you later, bro." I slammed the door. I had just felt the grass under my shoes when I heard, as he drove away, "I'm just ready to get the hell out of here, Finnegan."